Welcome back to our Growing Disciples Daily Devotionals. This week, following Jesus' journey to the cross. After the Last Supper and Jesus' time of prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus was arrested by temple guards to be taken to the high priest. Remember, it's almost Passover time, and so Jesus' opponents are trying to move quickly and not make too much noise unless there is an uprising of some kind which they could not control. So we're at Matthew chapter 26, verse 57. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. Caiaphas, as the high priest, was the religious leader of the Jewish people. And to say that he is like an archbishop is to undersell his authority, with apologies to any archbishops who may be watching. To be high priest was like being the archbishop and the premier at the same time, with both religious and political power, and yet with obligations to the Roman state military and governors. Caiaphas had much authority, but not without limitations and duty to some greater power. Assembled with Caiaphas are the experts in the religious law and experts in the traditions of the people, the teachers and elders who formed this governing body called the Sanhedrin. And so a kind of trial begins. The Sanhedrin asks for accusations to be made against Jesus. Jesus was not arrested for any particular crime. Instead, now that he is arrested, they're looking for a crime to charge him with. Verse 59. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, two came forward and declared, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." Now, this charge is at least true. Jesus did say something like this, and it's recorded for us in John's Gospel, chapter 2, verse 19. Although Jesus meant that he personally would replace the temple as God's place of mercy and the new point of address to God on earth, the saying could be construed as instigating a push to destroy the Jerusalem temple. Of course, even damaging or speaking against the temple was considered a very serious crime, so to talk about its destruction was a very serious accusation. Verse 62. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. What the high priest was hoping was that Jesus would give some kind of defense, perhaps qualifying what he meant, because then the lawyers could trap him. Then they could argue and contend. But Jesus' silence gives them nothing to work with. So then the high priest works to provoke Jesus. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." "You have said so," Jesus replied. "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you've heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," they answered. Rather than being charged with a lesser temple offence, which would obscure his identity and his purpose, Jesus is now ready to engage with the high priest's much more serious accusation that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, is the very crux of the matter. This is exactly who he is and the reason that he is to be crucified. Now, the Old Testament figures of the Messiah and the Son of God were very much one and the same. The Messiah was to be specifically anointed by God, commissioned and empowered to lead Israel into a new kingdom marked by religious purity and physical prosperity. It would be life in the time of King David and King Solomon all over again, but better. The title Son of God was usually understood as a royal title, another David figure. Since Psalms like Psalm 2, the king was viewed as somehow adopted by God as a special son. Their royal office had divine approval. Interestingly, it's only after Jesus, the actual Son of God, eternally and fully divine, God from God, light from light, it's only after Jesus that we understand the title Son of God to be appropriate for God himself. He's no lesser divine as God's Son. Rather, it's his role in the actions of the Trinity as Son, the executor of God's saving power, that means this title, Son of God, is very appropriate. So Jesus responds to Caiaphas' question in the same way he responded to Judas's question at the Last Supper. You have said so. Meaning, you said it, yes, and we'll wait and see if it's true. But so there's no doubt about Jesus' claim as Messiah before Israel's leadership. He continues and he says, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, although speaking in the third person, Jesus is clearly referring to himself. But what does he mean, and why would this lead so suddenly to his immediate conviction of a crime worthy of death? Well, the answer is in Daniel chapter 7, a chapter that we've referred to several times in our Growing Disciples program. Everybody there in the court knows exactly which part of the Old Testament Jesus is referring to as well. It's in the context of a vision where all of the enemies of God are doing their worst, insulting God and rebelling against his rule, that the prophet Daniel says, chapter 7 verse 9, as I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. No prizes for guessing that the Ancient of Days here refers to God himself. He is going to rule in judgment over all his enemies. And the boastful rulers, who are depicted as beasts and horns, were slain and their bodies thrown into the blazing fire. But who did the conquering for God? Who remains, of course, seated on his royal throne? Like a victorious general returning from the battle, we then see one like a Son of Man who is presented before God. Verse 13, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So this one like a Son of Man comes before the throne with the clouds of heaven. Now the clouds of heaven, it's very likely a reference to the vast numbers of glorious angels, angel armies if you will, gathered like vast clouds filling the sky. This Son of Man, something a little bit like a human figure, right, is then honoured by God with all authority, glory and sovereign power. And he is worthy of worship, which is only rightfully due to God. He rules for God, with God, forever. So when Jesus makes this claim before the Sanhedrin that he is that Son of Man, Everyone is abundantly clear on what he's saying. That's why they immediately declare him worthy of death. They declare him guilty, actually without investigating his claim. Could it be true that he really is the Son of Man? As Jesus said to Caiaphas, yes, and we'll wait and see if it's true. And so with Jesus' unambiguous claim and confession, so begins the Son of Man's descent in a brutal injustice, abuse and violence. Verse 67. They spit on his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you?" Join me tomorrow as we follow Jesus' journey to the cross. It's a harrowing and barbaric journey which the Gospels do not shy away from. This is the rejection and suffering that Jesus said must take place. This is the pathway of the Messiah.